It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling this story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To make a long story short, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in that area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late, he ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did, so that wasn't unusual. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the woods when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the first time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time only to watch some guy walk right into the body and for some reason just turn around and walk away. Coincidence or not, the whole thing really gets you thinking. When I was a teenager, I was home alone one weekend and I was sleeping in my parents' room since there was a TV in there. Sometime around 2 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at from the direction of the hallway. I looked up and I saw a shadow person looking at me. It was weird because it was a pure man-shaped black mass and I could see him in the dark hallway. I'm guessing the light from the TV helped. I sat up and stared back, but I was terrified. We looked at each other for probably 5 seconds and then it turned around and walked down the hall. A few seconds later, I heard a loud crash. I was so scared I turned the TV to the Disney Channel and stayed awake for as long as possible. When I woke up the next morning, I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and that's when I noticed a mirror that was hanging had fallen off the wall and was shattered. My family still doesn't believe me, but I know what happened. When I was 3, my parents moved us into a new neighborhood. The house was nice, but kind of old. The neighborhood was an old 50s tract home area, so it had a pretty varied group of people living there, from older couples that had bought the houses new, to young families looking for a cheap place to live, to poor people looking for cheap houses to rent. As soon as we moved in, my dad started noticing weird things with me. He would hear me giggling and laughing in my room, and whenever he went in and asked me what was so funny, I would tell him that the kids were being funny. He would also come in to wake me up and find me curled up in the closet. This happened over and over again, but my parents didn't think much of it because I was a pretty imaginative kid. The thing that really got to them the most was that I flat out refused to walk out the front door. I would scream and yell and cry until one of my parents carried me in and out of the house. When you walked in the front door, to the right there was a closet and to the left there was a low brick wall that separated the front door from the living room. It was about 4 feet high and about 3 feet long. It was just a room divider, but I never touched it or wanted to be near it. After we had lived there for a few months, my dad started making some renovations to the house. Among them was demolishing the wall. My parents dropped my brother and I off with our grandparents the day they were going to do it so that we wouldn't be underfoot. We didn't end up going home for a week. When my dad knocked down the wall, he called the police. Inside the brick wall were bones that turned out to be from children. The cops never did figure out who put them there. The house had been owned by a lot of people, many of them who had rented it out. So it's just one of the many weird things that happened in my town that was never figured out. Now that I'm an adult, it's become one of those creepy stories from my childhood that my family retells on occasion. This happened 2 nights ago, so I'm still replaying it over and over in my head. I'm a pretty predictable person with a predictable schedule, so I'm not sure if this was a random occurrence or if someone knew my nightly routine. I'm a 35-year-old woman. My husband Rob gets up for work hours before me, so he goes to bed before I do. I usually get to bed a few hours after he does, around the same time every night. I turn off the lights and the TV in the living room and take my dog to the back door to let her out. She's tiny, old, and poses zero threat to anyone. The door leads to a large deck outside. Off to the right of the deck is a few steps down and a small path to a gate which we always keep chained and locked. Every single night before opening the door, I peek out of the window right next to it without disturbing the blinds and flip on the deck light. I never expect anyone to be there, and we've never had a problem with anyone trespassing or trying to break in. It's just something I do every night. It's kinda like looking behind the shower curtain before going to the bathroom. I know no one is back there, but if I don't check, then that's going to be the one time that there's actually someone hiding back there, you know? Hey, I watch a ton of horror movies and it's pitch black outside at night where I live, okay? Cut me some slack. So a few nights ago, I got ready for bed, went to the back door with my dog slowly following behind me and peeked out the window. I flipped on the light, and my heart jumped into my throat when I saw a skinny, dirty guy in his 30s or 40s standing off to the side of the door facing it. I see him raise his arm up and hold a screwdriver above his head as soon as the light went on, preparing for someone to open the door. I screamed, "Rob, get up, get the gun!" as loud as I could, which startled the guy, and he jumped over the rail of the deck even though he was right next to the stairs and ran. My husband ran out of our bedroom with his gun. He called the police and they showed up within 5 minutes. They drove around trying to find the guy, but no luck. The guy broke the lock on our gate to get in. He also pried open the back screen door, which we always keep locked as well. If I would have opened the door without looking out first, I might have been dead. I don't know if I caught the guy trying to break in or if he was waiting for me to open the door like I do every night. Either way, it was fucking terrifying. My parents are buying us outdoor security cameras this week as an early birthday present for Rob. The names in this story have been changed for privacy reasons, but I guess it doesn't really matter. I'm a fairly tiny 18-year-old girl. I'm only 5 foot and weigh maybe 120 pounds. I just started my first year at college and I decided to live on campus. During the first week here, there were a bunch of activities for us to get to know our class. They were mostly just stupid icebreakers and just telling us about stuff to do on campus. During one of these activities, I met a guy named Alex. He seemed friendly enough. He was eating lunch alone, so my friend and I decided that we would ask him if he wanted to sit with us, just trying to be nice. He said sure, and we talked a bit. My friend and I both got his number and we spent the rest of the time going through the stupid little games together as a group. After that day, we really didn't think about Alex. He texted me a couple times asking if I could hang out, but I was pretty busy getting adjusted to college, so I never really had the time. Then, one day, he caught me outside one of the main buildings on campus. He asked where I was going and I told him I was on my way to class. He offered to walk me there and I didn't really think much of it. A lot of guys had walked me to class by that point and it was nice, albeit a little annoying and inconvenient sometimes. He walked me all the way to the room my class was in before saying goodbye and leaving. Again, I figured he was harmless. He started texting me more and I tried to respond the best I could, but that wasn't enough for him. He would text me repeatedly, asking why I wasn't answering him, who I was with, and what I was doing. Finally, I got fed up and told him that he needed to stop and that he didn't have any authority over me and that I had no obligation to text him back. He was taken aback slightly, but admitted that what he did was wrong and said he was sorry. I just dropped the situation altogether. After all, I had more important things to worry about. 3 weeks later, midterms came around and me and my roommate were pretty stressed, so that night we decided to just sit outside of our dorm building under a tree and talk. My campus is a pretty safe place, so people tend to be out at any time of the night. It's not really a strange occurrence. Then I got a text from Alex that just said, "Where are you?" I didn't respond and I didn't really want to see him anyways. A couple minutes later, I got another text that just said, "I see you." I looked around after receiving it and there he was. standing about 60 feet away just looking at me as if I had completely betrayed him. I showed my roommate the text and she just laughed, saying he probably had a crush on me. She dismissed me and waved him over, and he waited a minute before actually moving. When he got there, he just sat down and stared at me. We tried to make a polite conversation, but he didn't seem to particularly want to talk. He just sat there and fucking stared. Eventually, I was more than freaked out and my roommate had realized her mistake. I suggested to her that we go inside, get ready for bed, and go to sleep. The doors here are all controlled by keycard and your card will only let you into your specific building. So I swipe my card and go through the door and my roommate follows after me, and before it can swing closed to lock, Alex places his hand on the door and comes inside with us. We were stopped dead on the stairs just looking at him with the epitome of, "What the fuck are you doing?" written on our faces. He just shrugged his shoulders and followed us up the steps. At this point, we didn't know what to do. My roommate stupidly thought maybe he just wanted to hang out for a bit longer, so she invited him into our dorm room and suggested we watch Netflix. He stayed in our room for almost 2 hours until around midnight, and the whole time I stayed on the opposite side of the room from him. He just gave off such a creepy vibe. He didn't watch the show on Netflix, he just kept fucking staring at me. Eventually, I suggested that we go to the dining hall next door to our building. It was open 24/7 and I was looking for any way to get him out of the room. We left, got food, and then I stated that me and my roommate should get to bed. I told Alex goodnight and to have a safe walk home, not even stopping to look at him. I opened the door with my card, went inside, and my roommate, who was beyond freaked out at this point as well, followed very close behind. And again, before the door could swing closed, Alex put his hand on the door and followed us inside. I turned around and plainly told him, "Go home, Alex." He didn't move one way or the other, he just kept fucking staring at me. "You need to go home, we need to go to bed," I told him again. "No." That was all he fucking said. I was past frustrated at this point. I just rolled my eyes and looked at him again. I grabbed my roommate's arm and went to the door to our floor again opening it and having her follow behind. But again, when she didn't close the door fast enough, Alex followed us inside. I turned around again and told him that he wasn't to come into our room, and that if he felt like staying, then he was sleeping on the floor out in the hall for all I cared. I opened the door quickly and dragged my roommate inside and slammed the door behind me. I just got ready to sleep. If he was still out there, then he could stay there, it wasn't my problem. But my roommate needed to go to the bathroom, which was down the hall. She left and I told her to just make sure to close the door quickly. When she came back, she was slowly coming into the room, and I asked her what was wrong before Alex pushed his way past her and inside the room, closing the door behind him. At this point, I was livid. "What the fuck do you think you're doing? Go home!" I yelled at him. "No, I'm staying here for the night." His voice had this tone, one that implied that I was somehow the crazy one for telling him to get out of my room. I looked at my roommate, who had backed into her corner of the room. She looked like she was just in shock. "You're not staying here tonight. You're going to get out of here. Go back to your own dorm and leave us alone," I told him, trying my best not to scream since at this point it was around 1 a.m. "No, I'm staying here. I'm staying with you." He spoke to me like these were the nicest words he could say, like he wasn't doing one of the creepiest things possible at the moment. "You're not fucking staying here." I finally started screaming at the top of my lungs. "Get out right now or I will call the police and my RA. Get the fuck out of my room, Alex." At the threat of the police and the RA, his face lit up with worry. He knew what he was doing was beyond messed up. For some reason, he assumed that I would somehow just allow him to do this and not fight back. One more round of me screaming for him to get out and waking up my entire floor, and he finally left. I figured that this whole thing was a creepy but one-time thing. That after being screamed at to leave and get out, he would be able to realize that I wanted nothing to do with him. But that wasn't the case. When I would be walking around, I started noticing him following behind me. Not close enough to be obvious, but close enough that it made my skin crawl. I started noticing him waiting outside the buildings I had class in, even though I had never seen him before and knew for a fact that he had no class inside of them. He would wait at the entrance of my building, standing just across from the door, watching me until I went inside. He kept texting me too. He would send me Snapchats, call me, DM me on Twitter, anything he could use to contact me, asking why I was avoiding him. He would tell me about something he saw me do that day when I had no idea he was there, give me compliments about what I was wearing in that exact moment. It was terrifying. Eventually, I got so fed up with him after bombarding him with messages to leave me alone and stop following me, that I finally reported him for stalking to the university and the police. This led to a full-scale investigation of Alex. The school and local police admitted his behavior fit the criteria for stalking, and they brought him in for questioning, basically just to ask why. Why out of the 50,000 people on this campus did he choose to do this to me? His answer still sends a shiver down my spine and makes me want to throw up. When they asked him why he did this, his only answer was, "Because she's mine." They found out that he had followed me and learned my entire schedule. He had a map of what paths I took to class, where I like to sit in the dining halls, what room and floor my classes were in. He even knew where my car was parked on the opposite end of campus. He kept a record of all the things I wore, what color they were, if I wore makeup that day. My university issued a no contact order that, for those who don't know, is sort of like a watered down restraining order. He's not allowed to have direct or indirect contact with me at all. The police are still filing the case but have recommended I try and get a restraining order as well. I have friends who walk me to and from class almost every day. Everyone in my building knows what he looks like, what his name is, and to not let him inside or anywhere near me. I hope my experience wasn't too hard to follow. I mean, obviously there are parts I still don't entirely understand myself, like how he got some of this information or really why he thought I was his. Anyways, that's my story. First off, I would like to state that this is a true story and I have no intentions to share anything made up. Anyways, this happened when I was a freshman in high school. It was a usual Friday night for us in a small town in a very rural part of Arkansas. Me and my friend, who we'll call Seth, were really close at the time and spent just about every day with each other after school. He was 17 and we had plans to hang out with two other girls who were a couple years older than me. Being in a very small town and going to a small school, everyone knew everybody and was pretty close. We showed up to one of the girls' houses after renting a couple scary movies and planned to just chill out there for the night and have a couple drinks. The girl whose house it was we'll call Sarah and her friend we'll call Melissa. After about half an hour of watching the movie Insidious, I think, Sarah out of nowhere asked if we wanted to play with a Ouija board. I was really into paranormal stuff and have always wanted to try one. After a couple minutes of debating with Seth and the other girl, we decided to give it a try. We set it up on her living room floor, turned out all the lights, and started asking it questions. Unfortunately for me, it never moved. We kept trying, but still, no luck. We started talking about the place that we were trying it and thought that that might be why we weren't getting any responses. Sarah and I remembered an old Indian burial ground not far from her house that we had been to before with other friends. This place was from the late 1800s and it wasn't like a normal cemetery where people were buried underground. The bodies were laid on top of the ground and they basically built a coffin out of rocks. We all decided that we wanted to go, so we grabbed a couple candles and headed out. When we walked outside, it was pitch black and raining. A perfect setting for something scary, just like in the movies, I thought. All four of us piled in the front seat of Seth's four-door truck because of how scared the girls were. We took off down multiple deserted dirt roads through the middle of nowhere. But because we knew where we were going, we only had to suffer through the pouring rain for about 30 minutes until we arrived. This place was in the middle of the woods and no one lived around here. As soon as we parked the truck, Seth pulls out a half-empty bottle of UV blue and starts chugging it, not acting very interested in what we were doing. Me and the girls eventually faced our fears and jumped out of the truck while it was still raining and walked over to the pile of rocks. After a few minutes of wondering if this was a good idea or not, we laid the board down on one of the rock coffins and asked if anyone was there. It immediately moved to yes. The girls started screaming and I saw a tear run down Melissa's face. I tried calming them down so we could ask more questions. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on all the questions that we asked due to time's sake, but every basic question you would ask a Ouija board, it came back with a very intelligent answer. I specifically remember asking the board how it died, and it responded with the letters FLU. I knew that none of them were moving the piece because as soon as it spelled this, everyone started questioning what it meant. FLU, what does that mean? After a few seconds of wondering, Sarah shouted, "Oh my God, the flu! He died from the flu!" Chills covered my body as the girls started crying their eyes out. We decided that we had had enough of this spirit we were talking to, so we said goodbye and moved on. I tried comforting the girls because I wanted to keep going. After about 10 minutes of calming them down, I talked them into moving on to another rock and trying to make contact with someone else. So we sat the board down on another rock and tried again. We asked it the same basic questions, but this one was replying with random letters that didn't make any sense. Seth's drunken self was standing over our shoulders. Barely able to stand up on his own, he started making smart-ass comments about the spirit, most likely to show off and act like a badass in front of the scared girls. We looked back at the board and without asking it any questions, it very rapidly spells out "stop." The girls started freaking out again and started to yell at Seth for making that comment. I asked the board, "Stop what?" And it instantly spells out "joking." Now I'm becoming freaked out myself as the girls continued to yell at Seth. I stood there just staring at the board in pure terror. At this moment, a frog jumps on my leg and scares the shit out of all of us. In a very fragile voice, I asked the board, whose foot did that frog just jump on? The board then spells out my name as the girls looked away crying. They got to where they were shaking from fear and cold rain was pouring down on them. Landon, it spelled out. Without even saying goodbye, we all immediately started running back to the truck, and as soon as I got inside, tears started running down my face from how scared I was. And I'm not the type to get scared easily. I drove us home because Seth wasn't in the right state to be driving at the time. And the long, dark, rain-covered dirt road seemed like forever before we escaped the narrow paths and back onto the highway. I canceled my plans for the rest of the night and went home to where I felt safe and away from the board. This happened in southern Brooklyn in New York City, in a part of the city where it's in between two neighborhoods called Bensonhurst and Gravesend between the late winter and spring of 2012. My apartment building had recently been purchased by a new landlord and was undergoing a much-needed renovation. This was because it was an old building that was built sometime in the 1920s. This is relevant due to the fact that the construction workers would sometimes, foolishly, leave the front door of the building wide open with the lock removed, which pretty much allowed trespassers to waltz right in. I was home, 18 years old in college, snowed in the middle of winter. I was watching episodes of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart on Hulu on my bed in the same living room when I hear the sound of keys jiggling near the door and the sound of a key going through the lock. Thinking it was my mom who was coming back from work, I thought nothing of it. Well, that was until the sound persisted. Confused, I called out, "Mom, do you need any help?" The sound still persisted. Again, the door was to my immediate left from my bed, so I was beginning to get a bit unnerved and suspicious. I very quietly got up from my bed and went up to the peephole to see some Asian guy trying to picklock the door. I could almost feel my adrenal glands swell with adrenaline and I started thinking fast, while still being admittedly shit scared as well. I hastily went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, and then stomped towards the door, not hiding my presence anymore. Before I could even do anything, I heard him bolting down the stairs. The funny thing about the apartment door though, the door had 3 locks on it, 2 of which were broken and not actually used to lock the door. I guess the guy didn't notice the lock towards the bottom below the other 2 locks, which were bigger, so luck was on my side here. However, unfortunately, the story doesn't end here. A few months later, there is now scaffolding around the inner courtyard of the apartment building, where workers were now re-bricking and repainting the facade on our side of the building. The scaffolding was so thorough that they were basically up against the windows of the building. This will be important later. My mom and I had now moved downstairs to a newly renovated apartment and it was now spring. One night, my mom looked out the window from our new kitchen and quickly killed the lights. I joined in quietly to see what was going on, and I see a cop with a flashlight looking around the courtyard and around the scaffolding, and I notice him picking up a wallet from the ground. He radios it in, and I could have sworn I saw the light from his flashlight show a splat of blood on the ground. I didn't know about this until the end of the year, but my Italian neighbor who lived in this building since the 80s and now lived across the hall from me told me that some junkie used the scaffolding around my building to get to her window and was trying to break in. Thankfully, her window was locked and she happened to be sleeping near that very window, so she caught him quickly. The guy tried to make a run for it, but ended up falling a good 20 or 30 feet onto hard concrete and limped away. From what I heard from her, the guy had literally broken his spine. He was found by police on the corner of my block where he had died of his injuries. How he managed to get that far with a broken back is beyond me. She and I both think that it was likely the same guy who tried to picklock my door just months before, because our descriptions of him matched up to a T. Now, the detail that scares me most is something my mom had just told me about a week ago. She told me that there were numerous times where she had seen flashlight shining into my room, a black figure on the fire escape by my mom's window in her room, and 2 sets of shadows that you could see just underneath the door to our apartment for months leading up to this incident with my neighbor. She thought it was just isolated incidents of assholes trying to rob the building since a neighbor upstairs got robbed through the roof a couple of years ago. However, I personally think it had something to do with the druggie almost 100%. I'm a hardened and native New Yorker who has seen his share of things, especially since I grew up in the Lower East Side in the 90s back when it was a war zone before I moved to Brooklyn. But to feel like prey in your own home is something no one should ever experience. So this happened about 2 summers ago. I, 21 at the time, decided to go on Tinder because my job required anywhere from 70 to 100 hours a week. So I barely had time to sleep, let alone meet someone. I see this guy who is a very attractive 42-year-old. Yes, I know. We happened to match and we chat a bit and eventually exchange numbers. We text back and forth a bit and he ends up calling me. The phone call was pretty normal, no red flags that I'm aware of, and we set up a date for the upcoming week. The week arrives and I'm walking to a small park in the city to meet him. This may be awful to say, but I cannot stand a man who puts on way too much cologne. I could smell the guy from 10 feet away. He walks up to me and I immediately feel like something is off, and I thought, hey, maybe I'm just being paranoid. And this is where the fun begins. We go to this restaurant and we're eating and drinking. He starts receiving phone call after phone call. Within the hour that we spent at this restaurant, he took about 6 or 7 phone calls, all speaking in Hebrew. So my Spanish ass didn't understand a single word he was saying. I'm fuming at this point, and when he hangs up the call, I tell him that he should take his phone calls and that I would rather go home. He tells me he's sorry and that it's his birthday, so his family is calling him to wish him a happy birthday. I find it odd that he'd want to go out on a date with some girl he met online rather than hang out with his friends, but maybe I'm thinking too much. At this point, this guy is a few shots in. He starts grabbing me aggressively and I tell him to back up a little, that we just met and I don't want him touching me that way. He then stops. At this point, I should have left and I don't know why the hell I didn't. The check is taken care of by him and then he asked me to go get drinks with him. I assume this meant walking to get drinks because, as I said, homeboy is a few shots in and I think he's a little tipsy at this point. But he says he wants to drive to a different bar and I refused to get in the car if he was planning on driving in his current state. He asked me to walk to his car because he needs to sit down before we go to whatever bar we were going to. I'm not too alarmed by this because it was a very well-lit, populated area of the city. We get into his car and he asks me if I wanted a drink. I have this puzzled look on my face and he starts laughing, gets out of the car and opens the trunk. This guy comes back with 2 sippy cups and a bottle of whiskey. I look at him and I ask him first, "Why do you have those cups?" At the same time, I turn around and see a car seat in the back. This idiot has a son. He's using his son's sippy cups to pour whiskey in them. He offers me a drink and I deny it because, well, I'm not drinking whiskey, A, in your car, B, out of your son's sippy cups, and C, a bottle that has already been opened. He starts getting agitated and he gets back in the car, closes the door, and asks me if I wanted a drink, to which, again, I replied no. I told him, "Listen, you shouldn't be drinking in your car like this. You can get arrested. There are cops all around here and you're 42. You're old enough to enter a bar." With that, he gets visibly angry and his voice gets louder and he says, "Shut the fuck up." At this point, he grabs me by the hair and he tries to jam his fucking tongue in my mouth, and I tell him to get the fuck off me. He stops and looks at me and raises his fist to try and punch me. My adrenaline kicked in and I started punching as hard as I could and ran out of the car with tears in my eyes. As I'm running, these 4 guys come up to me and they say, "I kid you not, why the fuck are you hitting my friend?" At that moment, I didn't really process the question and I kept going. I got into the first cab that pulled up and went home. When I got home, I started wondering, wait, why were those 4 guys there in the first place? Were they his friends? What were they planning on doing? I was terrified at this point, but grateful to have been able to make it home safely. And it doesn't end here. The next morning, I get a text from this guy on WhatsApp. He sends me an audio message of a woman who he apparently is speaking to, telling him all these things she'd be willing to do, and how much she likes to party. He then says, "I wish you were more like her. You're so much sexier. Why did you leave last night? We should hang out again." I'm staring at my phone in disbelief. I know damn well he was not drunk enough to forget. I should have blocked him, but instead I responded telling him he was absolutely insane. He responded with, "You're a fucking crazy girl. You're such an immature 21-year-old. I knew it when you were in my car and you didn't want to take that drink." He said if he ever saw me on Tinder again, I'd regret it. I immediately blocked him and deleted my Tinder shortly after that. That honestly was one of the scariest encounters. What scares me most is that his friends were right around the corner. I still have no idea what their intentions were. In 1994, when I was 23, I decided to go on a week-long camping trip alone to get my thoughts together. I had just graduated from college here in California and needed to make some decisions about my future. I decided to go camping in the Los Padres National Forest as I had been there before as a kid and it was quite peaceful. I packed my things, drove to the park, and bought the week primitive camping pass I needed. I told my parents where I was going and they weren't too excited about me going alone, but as I am a male and well built, they only asked that I pack a knife for protection and be safe. I obliged. I parked my car and set forth down the trail that I had chosen. My plan was to hike to a small pond that was about 12 miles down the trail and spend my week there fishing, relaxing, and thinking about what I should do with the rest of my life. I hiked from morning to about 6 p.m. and took my time taking pictures, eating my lunch, and even writing in my journal. At about 6 p.m., I finally reached the pond and unpacked my tent and equipment and got ready to sleep. I was so tired that I passed out and didn't wake up until the morning. In the morning, I made some coffee, made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and threw my fishing line into the pond. Over a couple of hours, I caught a couple of bluegill and was getting some much-needed solitude. I gutted my fish and put them back in the water so that they would stay cool for a couple of hours so that I could make them for lunch. After this, I went back in my tent and decided to take a nap. I fell asleep fast. About 30 minutes into my nap, I was awoken by a woman crying hysterically from what seemed to be a few hundred meters away. I instinctively got up quick, opened my tent, and turned towards where I had heard the crying. What I saw scared me instantly. I saw a naked woman about 70 meters away in what I would guess was her 40s walking in my direction. She had long brown hair that was tangled and her face was contorted in a way that made her cries that much more frightening. This woman was filthy all over and she was bleeding from what I could only describe as her genital region. My first reaction was shock, but after a few seconds I cleared my head and ran into my tent to grab my knife. I then walked over to the lady who was still crying hysterically and asked her what happened. As I got close to her, she reached out to me as if to embrace me. I hesitantly gave her one of my hands to hold on to and then walked her over to my tent. She didn't say a word, she just kept crying and leaning herself on me. When we got to my tent, I handed her some paper towels and some extra clothes I had and asked her again what happened and if I could help her clean up or help in any way. She ignored the towels and clothes and just let them fall to the floor. She then asked me in a smoky/exhausted low voice if she could lay down in my bed. I thought she was a rape victim for sure and told her yes, definitely. She laid down on top of my sleeping bag and just kept crying and shaking. I decided to just let her be for a while and started packing up my stuff, as I figured I would have to run back to get help for this woman, as there was no cell phone reception here. After about 25 minutes, I collected all of my belongings and walked over to the tent to see if the woman had calmed down. I unzipped the tent and looked inside. The woman was just lying there, no longer crying, but just staring at nothing. I asked her again what had happened, but she didn't answer. I then began to tell her that I was going to run and get help and that she could come with me or just stay here until help arrived. Again, she said nothing. I then told her that I was going to run to the ranger station and that I would be back as soon as possible. I left her some water and some food and started walking back towards the trail. As I got to the trail, I heard a man's voice yelling from across the pond from our point. I turned to where I heard the yelling and I saw a man about 200 meters away, also naked with a long beard and lots of body hair. I could not understand what he was saying at first, but as he got closer I could understand the words, "I am no good, I am no good," in a low, almost unintelligible groan. I was so freaked out at this point that I was frozen in fear. I was thinking about my options when I noticed the woman getting out of the tent and start walking towards the man with arms wide open. He then began running towards her and she towards him. When they reached each other, they then embraced. At this point, I was in total confusion and shock about what was happening. I just stood there and watched whatever it was I was watching happen. After what seemed like 30 minutes, they let go of each other and I could see them talking. The woman pointed towards me and then pointed towards her stomach. They then talked for a little while longer and then both of them started walking over towards me. I again just stood there trying to figure out what was going on. As they got within 50 meters of me, the woman and man both yelled at me almost simultaneously, "You can help us." I, still confused, yelled back at them, "Help you with what, and what happened?" The man and woman did not reply but only put their arms in a baby swaddling position in the universal signal for baby. I yelled back at them, "What baby?" in a concerned voice. The man then said something along the lines of, "I am no good, we need you for a baby." I then said I don't understand and started to take a few steps back. At this point, the woman grabbed 2 large rocks from the ground and handed one to the man. They then began running towards me. I was terrified and dropped my backpack on the ground and started sprinting as fast as I could down the trail. I could hear them screaming at me that they need my help with the baby over and over again as they're scrambling down the trail behind me. They had no shoes and the trail was very rocky, so I knew if I just kept running that they would not be able to keep up with me for long. After about 15 minutes, I slowly heard their cries die down to the point where I could no longer hear them. It took me 6 hours to get back to the ranger station with me running and then taking a break when I needed to. When I got to the ranger station, I threw open the door and began explaining what just happened to the ranger. He knew I was serious from the emotion that I conveyed and told me that he was going to get some backup to go out there and check out the situation and to retrieve my belongings for me. They advised me to just sit tight in the ranger station and that they would be riding their ATVs out there within the hour. I told him that I would rather just go home and he could just call me after they investigated, as I lived 2 hours away. He said that was okay. I drove home, told my family what had happened, and waited. I ended up falling asleep on my parents' bed like a child and slept through the night. The next morning, my father woke me up and told me that he had just gotten off the phone with the Rangers and that they had taken a naked man and woman into custody. They told my father that the 2 people would not identify themselves and that they found them on the trail walking back to the direction of the pond. The man and woman were taken to a psychiatric hospital and were both identified as schizophrenic individuals. Nothing else was really known about them. They couldn't figure out who they were or how they had gotten to that location. That is all they could tell us. As far as my equipment, I told them that I didn't want it anymore, as much of it was probably caked in blood and who knows what else. We found out a few months later that the couple had set up a campsite hidden near the edge of the pond area and that the Rangers had found one grave there of a very small fetus. The man and woman were identified as a married couple who had gone off their medication and decided to move out to the woods to live away from society. They, from what everyone guessed, had tried to start a family out there, but due to malnutrition, the woman had a miscarriage. I guess the man had blamed himself for being no good and wanted me to take his place in impregnating his wife. This is by far the creepiest thing to ever happen to me, and I have never been camping again since that day. This has forever changed me as a person and has made me very wary of strangers. I hope no one ever has to experience what I did on that day.